Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana. If you're new here, if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is July the 14th. It is Wednesday. It's not Thursday, although I've been saying that all day. I've been thinking that all day as well. Today, again, July the 14th. And today we're going to talk about something that has been a really hot topic for a lot of you, for a lot of people across Alabama and nationwide over the last few weeks. And that is critical race theory. Now, this is why we're talking about critical race theory today. Yesterday, members of the Alabama Board of Education, that state board of education, met to talk about a resolution, that dealt with critical race theory and some other diversity issues that we have been seeing across the state in schools. Our own education expert, Trish Crain, who works for our education lab, is here today to talk about what happened yesterday at the state meeting. We know that Governor Kay Ivey was in attendance. And then we're also going to talk a little bit more about critical race theory, about why people are upset, and if there's actually a reason to be upset. So Trish, thank you so much for coming today, breaking this down. This is a topic that is kind of hard to understand. There's a lot of moving parts to this topic, and there's a lot of parts of this topic that are different depending on where you are in the country. Now, we know in Alabama, critical race theory, correct me if I'm wrong, is not taught in any Alabama schools.
Correct. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So we have that. We can go ahead and say that's a blanket statement. We will go ahead and make it. Now, before we talk about what happened yesterday, we're going to get into that. But first, let's talk about why this became a big deal, why people began to get upset. We know that we had a lot of talk recently about a city school system. Mountain Brook City Schools recently had a meeting where they spoke about some anti-bias training, some diversity training that parents did not want to continue. We know that conversation kind of fed into some of this critical race theory conversation, whether rightfully so or not. But a lot's happened with critical race theory in the past few weeks. So if critical race theory is not taught in any Alabama schools, why are people in our state up in arms about it? Why is everybody so upset about it?
I think that the reason people are upset about critical race theory, it began as a conversation outside of schools. It began as a conversation in the national news. It began as a conversation, among people that were not in schools, but no one had brought it to a school board. No one had challenged it at the school board level. No one had brought any curricular materials forth to say, look, they're teaching my child critical race theory in K-12. And as Dr. Mackey said at the June 10th meeting, he said, we're trying to get ahead of this. I haven't, nobody's brought me any examples. Nobody has really, nobody's screaming at me about this. They're just asking, is critical race theory taught in schools? They're okay generally when I say that it isn't, but we felt like as a board, we needed to come forth with some sort of statement to say, yes, we agree critical race theory is a concept that should not be taught in schools, and here's some other things that we believe. So, it was a surprise at the June 10th meeting at the work session. Usually the agenda is set in advance. In my 10 years of covering the school board, I've never seen a surprise resolution like that. So it was unusual. And you could tell that some of the board members hadn't seen it. It was like a resolution that Dr. Mackey said he worked on with Nick Moore, who works for the governor's office, for Governor Ivey as the education expert. And so, they laid this resolution out on the table, and there was a little bit of a discussion, but it was like, let's come back next month and let's talk about how we really want to word this, because it's, and to be fair, a resolution is sort of a statement, but it doesn't really have a lot of weight. There's nothing actionable in them usually that says, and you're going to get fired from teaching if you do this or anything like that. It's just really like a statement. So
that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that last month, this came up last month at the State Board of Education meeting. And I'm glad you said it was kind of a way to get ahead of it, or that is what State Superintendent Dr. Eric Mackey said. It's a way to get ahead of it so that we don't have to deal with, any problems arising from it. Of course, still have had to deal with that, still have had a lot of conversation about it. So that was last month. So let's fast forward to yesterday, July the 13th, when we had that next Board of Education meeting. So State Board of Education met. I believe there are 8 elected members, and then the governor, who makes 9. The governor is the, I believe, the chair or the president, however you want to call the head of the president, however you want to call the head of that. And this is when they talked about the new resolution that they have decided to bring up for a vote. So I'm going to read to you, and this is again in your story that we're going to link here. This resolution says the state will not support educational standards or resources that, quote, indoctrinate students in social or political ideologies or in theories that promote one race above the other, end quote. So that is what came up yesterday. That's again, but that's from your story we're going to link here. Go ahead.
Let me be clear. So what actually happened on the ground yesterday, it came up in the work session. They meet in the board meeting, and this is the shortest board meeting ever, 10 minutes. Everybody moved into the work session. The governor stayed for the work session, which she does sometimes, but doesn't always. But she was there. And first, Dr. Mackey brought last month's resolution forward, and he said, we're all going to discuss this, because some of the board members said they were gathering information and they didn't really want a new resolution to discuss yet. They wanted to discuss the first one. So they spent a good long time talking about it, and everybody had something to say. And then during lunch, they went on and did some other business. The governor left. During lunch, their attorney, Jason Swan, the general counsel, he sort of took the comments from the morning's discussion at the work session, and then they handed this out at the, where's the camera? At the very end of the work session. So I stuck around and I asked for a copy. And so this is the one. Now this one is the one that the board members will be giving more input and comment on. They didn't discuss this particular one, the new one, at all yesterday. He just said, look it over. Get back to me by July the 30th. We'll take your comments again, and then we'll craft something to put in front of you at the August 12th board meeting. And that is going to be the first time that the public gets a look at it. And to be clear, Dr. Mackey said this is about board members' comments, not public comment, right? So he's just taking board members' comments, because this is the board's resolution. This is not like a law. It's what does the board believe and want to do.
That's a good point. So I'm making some notes here in front of me, so forgive me for looking at that and then for these comments as well. But that's a good point. So this new proposed resolution, we'll call it, was given on this sheet of paper to members. You stuck around and you got a copy of it, and that is how we have it. So this is my, and I know, again, you've made clear resolutions do not necessarily mean it is a law. This resolution I read aloud, I've got some people saying, look, I can't believe that, or other comments regarding this resolution, this proposed resolution. So let's just talk about, if the board members did not discuss this and their input was not into writing this, who wrote this proposed resolution?
Okay, so the first draft, the one from June, was put together by Dr. Mackey and Nick Moore, according to Dr. Mackey. Nick Moore is the governor's education policy. I'd call him a guru, because he does a lot of stuff beyond K-12. And then this particular one, the new one, that they're now considering that they could rewrite again, that was, board members made comments yesterday, and they talked, Dr. Chestnut, she's one of the newest board members. Her area is the Black Belt. A lot of, District 5 is the Black Belt of Alabama. She said, there's a paragraph in the old one about Alabama is not an inherently racist state, and we declare. And she said, I don't believe that. I live it. It's real. And that was struck. That paragraph was struck from the newest resolution. So he incorporated, Dr. Mackey's attorney, Jason Swan, incorporated that input into what we have now. But then again, it can still change, right? One board member, Stephanie Bell, said it doesn't go far enough. Like, basically, you're trying to get ahead of this, Dr. Mackey, but if you don't settle this in a way that is good enough for most Alabamians, lawmakers are going to come in and settle it during the session. And that is, we already have 2 bills filed. This is, in my opinion, this is pretty moderate language compared to what I've seen. Tennessee just banned discussions outright. Georgia's Board of Education had a 3-page resolution. So, Do I use moderate when I talk about the State Board of Education? Not usually, but this is pretty, it's interesting. Like I could go really off on a tangent, Ivana, so pull me back. But
Well, I'm gonna ask you
okay,
again. I understand, and something that I want to just continue to make abundantly clear. Critical race theory is not taught in Alabama schools. It never
right.
has been taught in Alabama schools. And essentially, one of the points of this proposed resolution is that so it isn't taught in Alabama schools. Is that right?
That's true. And you won't see the words critical race theory in the resolution, which is interesting. But what it does, in essence, is say, whatever critical race theory is about, we're not doing it. And Dr. Mackey said it succinctly. He said, the purpose of the resolution is to say we're not doing CRT now and we're not going to do it in the future. And he always says, well, I'm state superintendent, I'm appointed by the state board. So anything can happen, elected boards change, state superintendents change, but CRT is not something to be discussed in K-12 schools. And then, I think one of the confusing parts, people get confused between what is critical race theory versus what is a discussion about racism
and that's what I was going to ask you right now. It's been a minute since I've been in a K through 12 school. So right now, what is being taught? If we're not doing critical race theory, again, Alabama has never taught critical race theory in its schools. How are educators talking to their students about racism and about history? Are they allowed to talk about racism, slavery, et cetera, and discrimination? Or is that something that they're completely barred from talking about at all?
No, you'll see in the social studies standards so we have a set of, every subject has a course of study that is based on standards, academic standards, things that we want children to know at each grade level, and the state board approves those. Periodically, those are reviewed. The social studies standards are currently under review. So, you just couldn't have picked a more politically charged year to review social studies standards than right now, but that's the case. And that will take a little while. It's Alabama people. Dr. Mackey made this clear, in our discussion after the work session. So, it's Alabama people. These are Alabama teachers. An Alabama superintendent is in charge of the social studies standards review. But right now, yeah, there is a discussion of Alabama history and slavery. Now, my colleague, Star Dunnigan, our colleague, she did a great piece a couple of years ago about how, they don't delve in very deeply. It's like slavery is mentioned, but you don't really go into like what was a slave's life like in Alabama. So it's just sort of like touched on, but it's not really, there's not really that deep. Well, and I've had somebody say to me, Trish, there's so much history. How do you get into it all? And it's like, well, I don't know, but like if you say that people are going to learn about this stuff, shouldn't people learn about this stuff? So the standards now do allow for discussions of racism and slavery and, but those are generally high school classes. You've got like advanced placement, U.S. history, you've got government courses in high school. I think it's still a 12th grade, one semester course. So yeah, it's there. And Dr. Mackey was clear, and the board members were very clear. We don't want to tie teachers' hands. Like we believe that there is a place for these difficult topics to be discussed. We want children to critically think. So we're not stepping on First Amendment rights. What we don't want is a teacher pushing a political ideology. They don't have any examples of it happening. But, it's like we just want to declare we're not going to tolerate this.
This is something interesting that goes along with your statement that you had in your story. And in the story, it says the resolution prohibits local districts from applying or accepting federal funding that, quote, requires or encourages the teaching of concepts or implementation of the practices contrary to this resolution. And that again gets into, there are a lot of schools in Alabama, I would probably venture to say most, that need funding and that need all of the help they can get regarding that. So if this resolution, number one, if it is passed, it's not a law or any sort of binding agreement, we'll say. So how can they add something like a kind of ban on funding of certain funds to the resolution if it's not a legally binding statement?
So The whole that paragraph about the federal funding is really aimed at a grant opportunity that the U.S. Department of Education put out under President Biden that says, hey, if you want to revamp your social studies standards to get more deeply into civics, we'll give you money to do that. Right. And it's really aimed at school districts. It's not even aimed at states. So they're kind of bypassing the state. And there are certain board members who said, that needs to be off limits. Like, we don't need our school districts applying for that money. So that's really what that is about. It won't affect things like Title I funding or special education funding. It's this specific grant that they're trying to prohibit participation by Alabama districts. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I'm looking through some of these comments here. I'm just going through the sidebar here. And I wanted to throw a few at you, Trish. One we have is a person who, and I've lost it now in my feed, but I believe it was somebody who said, I believe it was Delise. And she said that she taught for 38 years. So thank you for your work there in Alabama schools. I know I can't even imagine how hard that job is, Delise. But she says schools need to focus on teaching reading and math. Alabama continues to be the lowest in the nation on those topics. So while maybe social studies and CRT and diversity, anti-bias is an important topic, I think Delise is saying, look, one of the topics that we really need to focus on is reading, math, 2 skills that need to be taught for kids to excel past school. And we're continuously hitting the bottom. So if we're not teaching CRT in schools, why are we focusing all of this energy on it instead of focusing about the things we do teach, reading, math, STEM, etc.?
So I would say the school board, the state school board, is really focused on reading and math. I mean, it's not that they're not focusing on reading and math. Yesterday's work session ran until like 3:00. So this discussion happened between like 10:30 and 11:30. So they still had, these are marathons. I'm usually the only one left at the end of these, other than the board members and Dr. Mackey. But so I think the reason that this, Dr. Mackey said, yeah, I wasn't getting a lot. I was hearing a little bit about it in the community, but it's, Tennessee lawmakers took an action. The state board in Georgia took an action, and some board members approached him and said, what are we going to do? Like, we need to do something. Everybody else is doing it. What are we going to do? And I think that's why it rose again. For me, it stuck out because I've never seen a surprise resolution brought to a work session. Usually, going ahead and taking the step of drafting something and sharing it with them, and already having worked on it with the governor's office, that was new to me. I'd not seen that done before. I mean, it was kind of an efficient way to do it, looking back, like you had something to actually look at instead of just discuss. But I think they're really just trying to, this is a national political discussion, right? It hadn't really surfaced in Alabama schools, but there are, the Alabama Eagle Forum, the Alabama Policy Institute, there are some politically active groups that have said, okay, what are we going to do, Alabama? And, I think that's kind of maybe where that's coming from. But also trying to, again, Dr. Mackey, trying to get ahead of the discussion so that we make some statement of belief before something is maybe, these are my words, but before something is maybe forced on them.
Do you think, though, that is just kind of injecting politics into schools and into school boards? I think a lot of people kind of like to think that their schools are run separately. They are not involved in politics. The State Board of Education does exactly what is best for the students, for the kids, and for their education, and is not dabbling in that cutthroat world of politics. No matter what side of the aisle you're on, you can kind of agree that either way, it can be cutthroat. So what do you think that politics is playing a big part in this?
Okay, my computer just said it was installing software. I'm sorry. I hope it doesn't. But it feels, sure, this is a political discussion. Sure, we don't have any examples of this happening in school. Nobody's brought forth any particular discussion. The discussion in Mountain Brook is a very different discussion. It's about teacher training. It's not about critical race theory being taught to children. It's about diversity training for teachers. So even that isn't about critical race theory. So this is a, I've heard people who are, like, why are we discussing this? Well, this is made up. This is contrived. And then other people are saying, look, we want to know what's being taught to our children. We want to know. We don't want kids. The thing that I hear a lot is we don't want white kids to feel guilty for something that happened 200 years ago. And that isn't in critical race theory, and that isn't in Alabama's standards. Have we seen some examples across the nation where a teacher did something that was, over the edge of like, maybe went too far in the minds of parents? Yes. We've not seen that in Alabama on critical race theory. But again, Dr. Mackey gave examples of teachers who show age inappropriate videos. I can remember that happening with my kids. An age inappropriate book, a fifth grade book was assigned that was full of cussing. And it was like, what? So these things come up, but they are handled on a one-by-one basis. It's not like this crisis point.
I want to ask you, and you mentioned this as well. I have a comment from Brandy who says, I just want to know what you're teaching my kids. Mm-hmm. And I've heard that so much recently. Mm-hmm. And Trish, I wanted to know if you think that this interest maybe in exactly what is being taught, what is in textbooks, what teachers are saying and doing has risen over the past year with at-home schooling, where many people and parents are able to actually see what their kids are learning for maybe the first time, and not due to not being involved, but just because they aren't in the classroom. Now when they're at home, they can see the lessons that their kids are getting. Do you think that pandemic learning and that at-home learning has kind of increased the interest of parents as to what their kids are actually getting?
I do think so. I mean, that's a great point, because parents usually don't get a look at the everyday work as it's going on. But in the pandemic, parents were literally looking over children's shoulders. They were helping them with this information, with the homework, with the reading, with all of that. So absolutely. But, there should be transparency in what schools are teaching our children. I mean, that years ago when I was a parent and I was going to the school board meetings and I was asking for things, there was never a problem with getting a copy of a textbook to see what was happening. The thing now is teachers very rarely stick to a textbook. They're using materials that they get off the internet. Teachers pay teachers. There's the curricular materials that teachers use. I think districts have less control over that than they used to. It used to be very prescribed. So a teacher can pull off a lesson from the internet that might step outside the lines of what, the community feels is appropriate for their children. And schools are supposed to be responsive to their communities. You can't just, go back and forth, whatever the community wants. They're supposed to be, the schools are supposed to be the experts about these are the things that kids need to know, but parents are supposed to have a heavy dose of input into that. So I do think that, that parents, I kind of like it. I want to see parents ask, let me see the textbook. Let me see your curricular materials. It's a level of transparency that schools are not generally used to, though. They're going to have to get used to it, I think.
I see a really interesting comment. And again, it's gone up in my comment feed, so I do not remember the name of who said it. But somebody made an interesting comment of saying, look, if there's a parent who wants their child to be taught either critical race theory or some other sort of anti-bias diversity class, et cetera, could they just let their child take it and not let the other kids take it and let it be a parent option? Or is this, I know you mentioned earlier something about social studies standards. Is this something that is just being morphed into the new social studies program, or is this going to be separate?
So CRT is not going to be a part of the new social studies standards, according to Dr. Mackey, that there is no plan to add any teaching of critical race theory. Remember, this is an academic framework. It's for graduate students, and it's a lens through which we look at how race impacts policies and laws and ultimately people. That's really high level thinking. That's never going to be taught at K-12. I mean, that's what Dr. Mackey says. Okay. But things like, I think we'll continue to teach about race and racism and the impact of slavery on African Americans in the South and the Great Migration. I mean, I think we'll talk about all those things because they're in the standards. To what degree always depends on the teacher. Right? I mean, you got to think there are 45,000 classroom teachers, right, in 13 grade levels. So to control what every single teacher says in their classroom, it'll never happen. That's why the standards exist. It's a framework. It says, don't go outside of these. These are the things we think kids really need to know, and they're vetted and tested, and the state board agrees. And, there's time. There will be a chance once the social studies standards are put together, it'll be out there for public comment. So, I'll certainly bring that to you when it's time.
Trish, where can people find more about this information that you are covering with the Alabama Board of Education and the different standards they're working on? And how can people keep up with all of this news and your reporting?
Oh, wow. That was a good setup. Thanks, Ivana. We have this new thing we're calling Alabama Education Lab, and it's really exciting. I've got 2 more reporters reporting on K-12 alongside me, and an editor. And our editor puts out a newsletter every week. It's not a wrap-up of stories, but it's more like, here's what we're talking about this week. And there will be hyperlinks to stories. So that's a good way to keep up. It's free. It's, and we don't spam you and, send marketing stuff and all that. But there is a sign up, and I don't know, I was supposed to drop it in something and I think I forgot, but that's a good way to do it. And also, just stay tuned to AL.com. I mean, everybody's paying pretty close attention to this, but these social studies standards, Dr. Mackey said it'll be spring 2023 before the textbooks are voted on. I think the standards will be they could be in front of the board as early as next spring, because the work is happening right now. The people on the committee are meeting. Again, these are Alabama educators and Alabama people that are working on these standards.
Looks like we're going to be having this conversation then for quite a while to come. So, Trish, thank you so much for your expertise on this. I know that you have been, again, covering schools over 10 years here in Alabama, and also have been on this very hot topic of critical race theory and other, racism issues being taught in schools over the last couple of weeks when people have really gained interest. So, Trish, thank you so much. Everybody watching, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. If we didn't get to you and you have a question you want answered, feel free to email it to myself or to Trish. I will put our email addresses in the comments as well. So thanks for watching, and we will see you tomorrow.